On this episode of Business World, we're diving into two dynamic forces shaping industry today. The Panama Canal, a key global trade route that revolutionized international commerce by connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Its impact on global business is undeniable, making it a cornerstone of the modern economy. Stay tuned as we explore the world of innovation and business today. Friends, welcome back to Business World. Today we're with Professor Richard Tapia, Professor of International Relations and Political Science, right here at Miami-Dade College's West Campus. Our topic today is the Panama Canal, something that is getting traction on the news. A lot of things are going on in current events. Panama Canal is a significant player for economic engine for business, international business, logistics, commerce, and here we're here with the professor of political science, and we're going to discuss this very interesting topic, and we're going to get some insights. Professor, welcome and thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you for inviting me back on the show.
Absolutely. Hey, it's always a pleasure. I mean, we always get a lot of value from Professor Tapia. So, Panama Canal, so many things are happening, fast and furious on the news. Recently, the head of the State Department went to visit Panama. We all saw the footage. There was a lot of high emotions, a lot of people protesting on the streets. They had college professors saying that they were appalled that the United States was trying to take a imperialistic stance against Panama and get the canal back. What are your thoughts on this current event?
Well, what's interesting is we're beginning to see the same type of protests that took place in the 1970s that led to the 1977 treaty that President Carter negotiated with Panama, that negotiated the return of the canal by 1999 with certain conditions. Those conditions are that U.S. naval vessels are able to have free entry and exiting of the canal, or free use of the canal. Also, the neutrality of the canal, and that Panama would be the one that administers the canal. And this was a matter of sovereignty, right? Sovereign integrity for the people of Panama. And I think it's part of the reason that you saw President Carter negotiated and the Senate ratified it back in 1977 by 2/3 majority. Even though it was controversial at the time here in the United States, a lot of people were against that treaty. One of those people was current President Donald Trump at the moment. He was against it back in the 1970s, and he said it over the decades that he was against giving over the canal, but the canal was given over in 1999. And what you hear from President Trump now is raising on a lot of issues, and a lot of the issues have to deal with the influence of China within the region. And I think that's where the United States has had some type of misgivings on whether or not the neutrality of the canal can be maintained. Now, the United States has done interventions in the past when they feel that the neutrality of the canal has been threatened. But at the moment, there's no evidence to show that the neutrality of the canal is being threatened. But what the United States is basically raising is some misgivings, mistrust that they have with Chinese influence, Chinese companies administering parts of the canal.
And on that note, because that's actually, I think, the issue, right? So so I'm looking at this, and probably many Americans are as well, and they're saying, okay, so we have the executive branch, which is saying, well, the reason we want to step in and take possession of the canal again is because we have what they call a near-peer rival, which is China, right? They say that China is America's near-peer rival. They're about to become at par and perhaps beat us anytime soon. And China, as you know, and as you mentioned, has implemented what they call the Belt and Road Initiative all over the world, essentially. So my question is, okay, they're espousing that the reason that they want it back is because of China. Some have made the argument it's a pretext. What mechanisms are there to say, hey, well, show us the proof? Is it international courts, perhaps?
So let's talk about the mechanisms, and then I'll talk about the different factors, the underlying factors that are taking place. Sure. Because you're right, part of it is the rivalry. between the United States and a growing power, regional power, who's now trying to become a global power, which is China. And so the first part is, what is the mechanism in enforcing the treaty? It really is built on mutual cooperation between the two. They have a treaty in place. If Panama or the United States feels that either one has violated the treaty, one mechanism is they could go to the International Court of Justice. Another is that they could go, if they don't want to go to the International Court of Justice and they want the issue to be resolved more specifically, they could go to the Permanent Court of International Arbitration, where they're able to focus in on the issues and pick the judges or the arbitrators from a pool that's going to be able to determine the issue on a set of factors. That's another avenue. But in the past, the United States has used military intervention when they feel that parts of the treaty has been violated. Of course, the most recent example was 1989 with the invasion of Panama, because of multiple reasons. One, General Noriega at the time had attacked military personnel on the base, and so they needed to safeguard the canal. There was a fear that the neutrality of the canal had been violated, and of course the drug indictments that took place here in Miami that led to the invasion and the capture of Noriega, in which once the neutrality of the canal was maintained once more, once democracy was restored, is what I meant to say, then the canal was returned to the people of Panama once again. So the question is, what's the evidence to show that the neutrality of the canal has been violated? At the moment, there is none, right? So C.K. Hutchinson is the name of the company that operates both ports at both ends of the canal. And for people who don't understand, the canal has a series of channels. And to be able to enter and exit, you got to go through these ports. And a lot of the times, the ships have to be piloted in. The fear of the United States is, if a war were to develop in the future, a future coming war with China, and China has control of two ports, which China does not. It's a company based in Hong Kong, but the fear is that because China has cracked down on Hong Kong, because they're having influence on Chinese companies within their jurisdiction, that they're going to be able to extend that influence to the canal. And in an upcoming war, they could basically shut down the canal for U.S. military vessels if the U.S. has to move one fleet from the Atlantic over to the Pacific in order to support operations in a possible future war with China. So that's kind of like the preventive vision that the United States kind of has. If this were to take place, how do we resolve it? Do we wait for that to occur, that type of conflict, or do we nip it in the bud now, and do we put influence and pressure on Panama in order to basically allow that to take place? Another major issue is how the bidding process is taking place for, let's say, operations of the ports, for the building of the fourth bridge over the canal, because again, China does not control the canal. And I hear this in the media over and over again, that China controls the canal. It does not, right? The Panamanian Canal Authority is the one that controls the canal, and then they subcontract out different operations to different companies based on bidding. The American companies are not winning the contracts, which is upsetting not just the Trump administration, it's upset previous administrations. And when they asked the Panamanian Canal Authority to be more transparent on how does this bidding process work, you know, how did you make the selection, it's not very transparent. Now, the Panamanians are very efficient in running the canal. They've expanded the canal by 4 times its size. They've made the same amounts of investment that it took to build the canal. If you were to put it in today's dollars, it took about $10 billion to build the canal. They've expanded it to allow for these newer fleet of container ships, the super container ships as they're referred to, to basically pass through the canal.
I understand they did that recently. You make a lot of good points, you know, but again, I think that for there to be a rule of law, for there to be legitimacy, you just can't espouse, well, the Chinese are taking over. You need to show, like any other, you know, judicial process, international relations process, you need to show the proof, and I would argue you need to show it first to the American people, and then it would have to be legitimately contested in some court of law, international commerce. I mean, it makes a lot of people uneasy, and it creates a lot of uncertainty when you just say, hey, well, no, the Chinese are taking over. As you mentioned, it's run by a corporation out of Hong Kong. And I've heard the argument many times that, yes, it is a private corporation, although if the Chinese Communist Party would tell them to do X, Y, and Z, they would have to be, they would be forced to comply. And I understand that. But a lot of people are uneasy on how the process is going. I look back to, it was 1970s when Jimmy Carter negotiated the return of the canal with probably one of the best leaders that Panama has ever had, Omar Torrijos. Also, Manuel Noriega was also part of that negotiation. And there's something a lot of people don't know. At the time, Omar Torrijos and Noriega was going to execute the plan. They had come up with a plan that if the Americans did not return the canal, they were going to destroy it. It was actually, there's a lot of writings about it. It's called Operation Huele a Quemado, smells like burnt.
Right.
And that was a real plan that was really going to be implemented. Everything was ready to go if the day of the meeting with Carter, that they wouldn't actually return the canal. So it's interesting to, I wonder if certain sectors of Panama will, take that approach. And again, I know Omar Torrijos is not the leader. Manuel Antonio Noriega is not there. Now it's a more moderate government, but we saw a lot of emotions run high in the protests to the degree that they actually, a police officer was trying to make an arrest, and the crowd turned against him and started to beat him with sticks. It's getting violent. Go ahead, Professor.
So a lot of what we're seeing from the Trump administration with Panama is a lot of political posturing, because they've basically already negotiated with the Panamanian governments. They've resolved the issue. One, the Panamanians have said they're not going to re-sign with the Belt and Road Initiative with China. They're going to be more transparent in their processes. And the United States got a small concession, which was that Panama is not going to charge government vessels coming through. They weren't very clear on what government vessels, because already U.S. naval vessels don't pay any tariffs or don't pay any tolls as they're passing through the canal. So which government vessels are they talking about? It wasn't clear. And I think what you're beginning to see from the administration is them basically playing to a domestic audience, that they're getting tough with China, that they're pushing more towards nationalism.
A lot of unsolved questions. And we're going to talk about this when we get back. Friends, thank you for watching Business World. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with Professor Richard Tapia.
Get back to living and learning at Miami-Dade College. MDC offers more than 300 programs and career pathways. 96% of MDC graduates find immediate employment and carry no federal student loan debt. MDC graduates also earn higher than average annual salaries statewide. And now, MDC offers virtual, online, in-person, and blended classes. Financial assistance available for summer term. Learn more at mdc.edu/savings. That's mdc.edu/savings.
Friends, welcome back to Business World. Today we've been discussing the Panama Canal and the impact on business that it has with Professor Richard Tapia. Welcome back. We left off, there's a lot of unanswered questions. Okay?
Right.
What's going to happen at the end? How does this end? What is the most likely outcome for the canal? Does the U.S. go in there and seize it, or is this just a negotiation tactic to get the art of the deal, get what they want?
I do believe it's the latter. It's a negotiation tactic, and I think they've already gotten a major concession, which is that Panama won't re-sign with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I also think what the U.S. wants is more transparency when it comes to the bidding process. And they're hoping that American companies would be able to get more contracts for not just the operation of parts of the canal, but construction contracts. Panama really has expanded the lanes of the canal. Right. They're building a fourth bridge. So they want greater transparency. But so that viewers understand, who uses the canal the most is the United States and China. And the expansion of the canal, the major investments that Panama has done into the canal has been to facilitate trade on not just within the United States on the East Coast, but throughout Latin America and throughout Europe.
Okay.
And so here in Miami, we're seeing a massive expansion when it comes to international trade, when it comes to supply chains. And a lot of it has to do with the expansion of the canal. Miami really has been transformed when it comes to development, investment.
Sure.
Even Citadel, which is a major hedge fund, has moved their headquarters to Miami.
Yep.
So that type of commerce has been enabled thanks to the canal. So the Chinese are going to find a way to adjust, right, to having less influence in the canal.
And that leads into my next question, because who are the winners? Who are the losers? Obviously, the U.S. is the winner. Apparently, it's going to go the government's way. Who are the losers? I mean, who stands to lose? I think China. I mean, do you think it's China? And if so, how do they react? What is their response?
I think in the short term, the United States got minimal concession. I think we took a major loss on an issue that you mentioned earlier, which is reputational costs, right? And there's a lot of scholars that have studied this, whether it's Beth Simmons or others. When the United States basically puts pressure on our allies, and we do it in a way that is not very diplomatic. We do it in a way that many feel is using the leverage, right, using our political, economic, and social leverage on our friends in a very public way, where some could basically say, you know, you're kind of bullying your friends. You're using the threat of tariffs, right? President Reagan warned against this, whether it's with Canada, Mexico, Panama, that we should not be engaging in these types of threats with our friends, because what it does is it sows distrust. So when you need to negotiate on the short term, you get the results that you want. However, what were the results that you got? A very minor concession,
right.
2 minor concessions. But in the long term, the ability to be able to negotiate treaties going further, whether it's not with the Panama Canal, whether there are issues within the region, whether it's with Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, or others, there's going to be great mistrust.
And you mentioned such great points, and what comes to my mind is, so you go to your friends, which is Panamanians are allies, right? And
Correct.
You say, if you don't give us canal, we're going to take it, or if we have to invade militarily, we will. But your enemies, Cuba, what do you do? There's no response. There's no ultimatum. There's nothing. I mean, that's all I'm seeing it. You know, how can you treat your friends this way? How are you going to treat your enemies?
If you have a friend and you have a disagreement, we've been colleagues for a very long time. If I have a problem with a colleague, is it more reasonable to come and see them in private and say, hey, listen, I'm having trouble with these issues? Or do we do it openly in a meeting in front of all other faculty, in front of all other colleagues, right? And what type of trust would kind of be there if you were to call them out publicly, if you were to name and shame the person?
It makes no point, no sense to
me. And this is the issue with naming and shaming within international affairs. You do get what you want in the short term. Naming and shaming is very effective in getting what you want in the short term, but it has long-term repercussions to your reputational costs.
You're making them lose face.
Correct.
And again, I've dealt with in other matters. I've dealt with people that I've helped tremendously, and they have had tremendous success. And we had some issues, and when you lose face, you make enemies. That's the reality.
Right, and your adversaries.
And they don't forget.
Right. In the case of your adversaries. In the case of China, where the United States and China have both cooperative and adversarial interests, the question is, how does China adapt? And another way China is adapting is working through Nicaragua. At first, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China had pledged to basically make major investments within Nicaragua, which was going to be a second canal, which never materialized.
Right.
Also, part of the reason that the Panamanians decided not to re-sign with the Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just the pressure from the United States, it's also the fact that really China didn't materialize in a lot of their promises. So why did the Panamanians, why did so many countries in Latin America, Nicaragua, shift over to China? Because for a very long time, after 9/11, the focus was to pivot towards the Middle East and pivot towards Asia. So Latin America went ignored, and you saw the proliferation of a lot of autocratic regimes within Latin America, right? You saw the return of Ortega within Nicaragua and so forth. But at the same time, the United States left a power vacuum within Latin America, which China filled.
Absolutely.
And even though China has not fulfilled many of the promises of infrastructure, one thing that they are looking at is if they can't build a second canal in Nicaragua, can they build a rail system that'll connect one port to another port that could circumvent the Panamanian Canal.
Right.
If that plan were to be initiated and for it to succeed, it would cut 5 days worth of travel, and it'll be 5 days faster than going through the Panama Canal.
That makes sense.
So that's one way China is thinking of adjusting, and it'll be cheaper than building a canal.
That makes a lot of sense. I'll be frank with you, that's not going to be possible under this administration. They won't allow it. It's funny that you mentioned that the canal, that China was trying to build the canal through Nicaragua, because the original plan before the Panama Canal was actually to build it in Nicaragua.
Correct.
So they really studied this issue very, very carefully.
Back in 1902, right.
Yeah, that was the original plan.
Because there's a lake, the land is flatter.
Yeah, and they could do it too. There could be two canals. I don't think under this administration that's going to be allowed, because the response would be very aggressive. I believe so.
It'll be interesting to see what the response would be. I think you bring up some really good points, because part of the campaign of the Trump administration was to end the endless wars. So that was part of the campaign slogan, but at the same time, we hear about an intervention within Panama, maybe a possible intervention in other parts of the world.
Correct.
So how much...
Remember, but he's also...
How much military leverage are they willing to exert?
Right.
I'm not sure.
That's all true. But what else is true is that he wants to make America first again, or great again. And our biggest adversary, and it's not me, they said it, the administration has said it many times, is the growing threat of China, the near-peer rival. And all of this conflict is really, like how you said, it's really not about the canal. It's about how to get a geopolitical edge over your adversary, and specifically we're talking about China.
China definitely has a lot of adversarial interests towards the United States. I wouldn't categorize it as the most adversarial. I think Mitt Romney was correct in 2012 when he said that Russia is the biggest adversary that the United States has, and then second to that would be China. And I think part of the concern with Russia, and not only with China, we're talking about waterways, right? We're talking about the freedom of the seas. Commerce, right? We're basically concerned with Russia having the militarization of the Arctic, which will cut off new trade routes that are basically forming because of global warming, because of the climate crisis. You're able to go from Tokyo over to the United States and Europe faster going through the Arctic. And these northern routes are a lot faster than the traditional routes that once took place. And so if Russia is able to militarize the Arctic, they're able to kind of stop that commerce and the freedom of the seas. If you're able to militarize the Panama Canal, the neutrality of the canal becomes threatened, then you're able to kind of shut off commerce there. If China is able to build islands within the Spratly Sea, also known as the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, they're able to stop commerce going through those routes as well.
Well, and that's a good point. China has really played a brilliant role in the South China Sea. They build islands, they build radars, they build infrastructure for their military, air traffic control.
Correct.
And they haven't contested it in kinetic warfare. They have filed international lawsuits and say, well, we have a historical ownership to the South China Seas, and what they do is what they call lawfare, right? Unrestricted warfare. The concept is, instead of fighting in the battlefield kinetically, a real war, you fight in the court of law. So, you have an issue with us in the South China Sea? Well, come to court. Let's settle it in the international court. Oh, you lose the case in the international court? Well, you know what? That was a biased court. Come to China mainland. We have a judicial system. You guys come and let's contest. Let's discuss this. Let's have a trial in China under the rules, right? And it's a brilliant strategy.
Right. Well, when it comes to treaties, when it comes to international law, which if people are very interested in this topic, and I'm glad you bring it up, we teach international law and organizations here at the college. I'm teaching that course right now in the spring. And there's a lot of sources of international law. The first being, of course, treaties. After treaties comes customary international law. After customary international law comes the national courts, and then general principles of jurisprudence. So the treaties, the freedom of the seas, is what would basically dominate this type of discussion. Even though the United States have not ratified the freedom of the seas, the fact that so many countries have ratified it, you're talking about customary international law taking effect. And so what China's trying to do is what you just basically mentioned, trying to claim that these are not international waterways, this is actually Chinese national waters, and therefore commerce can't pass through there freely. The United States is basically putting military vessels and doing flyovers saying, no, these are international waters. We are going to maintain the freedom of the seas. And what China is concerned about is what part of the British strategy was in the 19th century, is that you could cut off these routes, and in doing so, the supply chain going into China.
Wonderful point. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This was a very spirited discussion. I think there's a lot of interest in this topic, and perhaps we should consider speaking more about it on another show. Friends, thank you so much for watching MDC TV. Till next time, we'll see you then. See a lot of good points.